understand the mystery. First take a look at the history. The words we use will give us clues. So join us now in Church Chatter.
Welcome to the Church Chatter podcast, where we unpack a different church word or phrase each episode. I'm Sam. I study language and power.
And I'm Dillon. I'm an ELCA Lutheran pastor.
I've got a candle lit, so we're ready to get started. It's been a few weeks. Been a few weeks. Dillon, what are you noticing recently?
Oh, just today that it's a beautiful day, but I have a tension headache. And so it's kind of a practical feeling. That's it.
My thing is practical too. We were sick last week, really, really sick. It started Monday night. Dillon and both of our girls woke up in the middle of the night puking, and then it was just a day or two of puking. And then 2 days later, I woke up sick. It was rough. I think it was the norovirus or whatever, and it was rough. And what's that line Andrea Gibson has in one of their poems, a line that goes like something about how a fever just makes you long for another regular day. So I'm kind of riding that high because we were so sick last week.
Yeah.
Now this week it's beautiful outside. We're going to go on a picnic to the park after this episode with our kids. And that's all. I've just been trying to appreciate not being down and out, stuck in bed, throwing up, sick.
Right.
I feel good.
Right.
All right. It's tax season. It's April 14th today. Aren't taxes due the 15th? Is that the day?
16th, I think.
16th, this week, right? So episode 74, we're talking about tax collectors. Are you ready?
Yeah.
All right. It's about the Roman Empire, right? So during Jesus's time, which there was Roman occupation, right? Tax collectors worked for the Roman Empire, who controlled Judea. And Rome didn't just, like, sometimes I think when we think of Rome collecting taxes, we're like, oh, there's a Roman who just comes and takes taxes, right? But they actually use a system called tax farming. This is where, essentially, wealthy people bid for the right to collect taxes in a given region. And then they would give their bid, right? If Rome accepted their bid, they would pay Rome up front. And then they went and collected taxes from the people. And then they usually charge people extra for personal profit, right? So this is how it worked. So tax collectors were traders, and some of these tax collectors, remember, were Jewish. So I have this real pet peeve when people are like, oh, the Jesus story isn't political. He was upset with the religious establishment. And my response is always, why do you think the religious establishment became corrupt? Because Rome corrupted them. Right? Rome is behind all of it. Jesus didn't have to come out and say, I hate Rome. He would say hate, but don't tear me apart on that one. But it was there. Also, remember, you've heard me say this before, but the Gospels were written, most of the Gospels were written down after the Second Temple had already been destroyed and Jesus was dead. So people couldn't just write down anti-Roman sentiments because they would be harmed, tortured, killed for it, right? So they had to say things in sneaky ways. So this is how the taxes were collected. It was Jewish people, it was Romans, it was just anybody who won the bid, right? So they were known, these tax collectors were known. I feel like it's pretty common knowledge if you're a Christian or in that world, people know that tax collectors weren't liked. But people don't really talk about why they weren't liked. It wasn't just because they were collecting taxes. They were known for their corruption, for being in cahoots with the Romans, and for overcharging. And they were often grouped with sinners in the Gospels for this reason, because they were working with the Romans. And go ahead.
They also interacted a lot with Gentiles, which would exclude them from synagogue life and temple life. And so they were kind of at the bottom of the social ladder. Also, I don't know if you're going to cover this, but it is interesting that in rather old translations of the Bible, you won't find the word tax collectors or that phrase. You'll find something called publicans. And publicans just means a tax collector. They worked for the public, quote, good, to collect taxes for the empire to help support it. So they were known as publicans.
Yeah.
And but older translations don't have tax collectors. That phrasing.
I keep trying to fix my screen and my head's a little cut off, but it's what it is. Yes, yeah, that's a good point to make, is that it wasn't always tax collectors, right? Translation processes evolve, but it's not just about spirituality or morality. Once again, we can see that the Jesus story and this whole tax collector thing, it's a political and social reality about real and practical corruption at the hands of Rome. So tax collectors would collect taxes people owed. This is the important part, which I already said, but I just want to really emphasize, plus an upcharge for their own profit. So that's why in places like Luke chapter 3, verses 13, John told tax collectors to only take what they were ordered to, right? And I think that's important. I think that's really important, because none of us have a clean dollar in our bank accounts, right? We are all wrapped up in a very dirty political system. What I mean is, Dillon and I both have jobs. We pay taxes. Our tax dollars right now, literally money that has come from Dillon and I's bank account, and yours if you're listening to this, that has paid taxes. They have paid for bombs that are being dropped on people and killing them, right? But if you're someone who's a Christian and the Bible expresses some ways to be for you, or you get any kind of wisdom from the Bible, we have John telling tax collectors not to stop being tax collectors. John isn't saying like, oh, be like John the Baptist and come live in the wilderness and like run away and live off the grid. That's not what we're being told. Instead, we're being told, don't steal from people. Don't upcharge, right? Like, I understand you have a job to do, but you can do it without corruption to the best of your ability. I think that's important. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Because I can be a person of extremes of like, oh my gosh, I have to live this morally pure life, and we have to sell everything. We have to sell everything. We have to go live somewhere else. We have to just like escape from reality. But that's not the point, right?
Well, right. And yeah.
Do you have something you want to say? We're not going to?
Well, I just think like, some people, they'll do that. And it's very admirable to boycotting is a thing, to boycott things and to put your money where your mouth is, that old phrase. But even if you're living in some off rural place where there's nobody around and you can do your own farming and whatever, there's something called, acid rain and other types of things where people from far away are still polluting the air, and that's still coming down. So that sounds like, oh, well, we're all doomed. And in some way we are, and in many ways we're not. So you kind of have to parcel it out a little bit. But to be a purist anymore, if that ever really existed, is not a thing that I think someone should beat their head against the wall about.
Yeah, there's no escaping it. Honestly, I'm writing this book right now, and I just wrote a section about like church functions at a practical, this is kind of a side tangent, but I think it matters. Church functions for me and a lot of people as this like place to practice loving your neighbor. Because I know a lot of people who are like, well, if I'm just a good person, then nothing else matters. Okay, but you're a good person who sits at home scrolling on their phone all day. I think that God would rather us go out and make mistakes and have to be forgiven for our mistakes out there in the wild than to just sit at home escaping and protecting ourselves by never going out and doing the hard work of like, are you sitting on committee meetings where that person communicates in a way that you just struggle with? Are you showing up again anyway? Are you, when somebody is sick, are you doing the very awkward, uncomfortable thing for you and going up and say, hey, you've been on my mind and in my heart, just so you know. Are you doing those things? Because I think that's the humanity of it. And church is one place. I'm not saying it's the place, but it's one place where that can happen. what I say this all the time, but Pete Holmes says it. If you think you're enlightened, go hang out with your family for a while. Go hang out with your parents. Go hang out with people from your childhood, right? You can be sucked back to who you used to be real quickly. But you have to go. You have to go to the places where you are not your best self because that's where you practice. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely.
There is no escaping. You can try, but that's not the point. And here with the tax collectors, we're being shown John isn't saying, hey, stop being a tax collector. John is saying, just stop being corrupt.
Right.
Stop upcharging people who you know can't afford that. They're struggling and you're profiting off their back. Stop doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you see, I don't know how in depth you're going to get here, but
we'll go wherever you want with it.
Well, there's three very specific passages in the Gospels in which Jesus either uplifts or calls. Actually, he's uplifting all the tax collectors. He's calling them to a different way, but he's calling them to follow him. So in Matthew chapter 9, verse 9, he's calling the tax collector to become one of his disciples. In Matthew's gospel, in Luke's gospel in chapter 19, which you get the Zacchaeus story. Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector.
In Jericho.
Which is a great story, especially for Sunday school kids.
Yeah, he climbed the tree to see Jesus, and then he promises to repay those that he cheated. Again, if you don't have this knowledge of tax farming and what that process is, it doesn't make sense. But then once like a tax collector, inherently to make money, they have to cheat. But here, Zacchaeus is saying, he climbs a tree and he says, I'll pay everybody back, right?
There's also a great...
That's called accountability, which is part of the repentance process. Yes.
Yeah, there's a great song that like Sunday school song that goes with that Zacchaeus story. I won't sing it for us, but I'll spare us. But and then there's also the parable also in Luke's gospel, which is a chapter before the Zacchaeus story in chapter 18, 9 through 14 in terms of the verses. And it's a tax collector that Jesus kind of justifies and uplifts to show humility, and not the religious leader. It's the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, or in older Bibles, the parable of the Pharisee and the publican. And it's interesting because you would think that perhaps Jesus would be uplifting the works and the duties of the religious leader in terms of morals and ethics, but he's actually uplifting the tax collector, who, although was not doing appropriate things, was kind of redeemed in some way and found himself in humility. And
which Jesus's original audience would have seen over and over again, Jesus flips the script of power. Yeah. People didn't like tax collectors because they were ripping them off. Because tax collectors, it wasn't just like, oh, I'm going to overcharge by 5%. They were allowed to overcharge by however much they wanted to overcharge by, right? And if you didn't pay, then they would tell the Romans, hey, they didn't pay, right? So they were seen as corrupt. So when Jesus says, oh, no, the religious leader, the Pharisee who's bragging about his righteousness, actually the tax collector is the one who asks for mercy and gets it. So like script flip, which is really interesting.
And we see in the Gospels as well that Jesus, now this means not too much to us now in modern times, because we eat with a lot of different groups of people. But if you were eating with what was known as public sinners, most of the time in the ancient Near East, including Jesus's time, as a Jewish person, as a Judean, you would be shunned. Again, not being able to be involved in synagogue and temple life. If you were associating with someone who was a public sinner, and there was a whole long litany and list of public sinners, including tax collectors, if you were seen eating with them, you too were a sinner, a public sinner. And Jesus was eating with tax collectors all the time. He was also eating with a lot of public sinners because he saw them as a kind of people who were pushed to the side and outcast and that really needed to be included. Not to continue perhaps in their current activities, but sharing a meal with them and fellowshipping with them was a core part of his ministry, which was not common at the time.
Yeah.
Kind of a real rebel rouser.
Yeah. My holder is being it's like dropping more and more. So I'm like sliding around so my face is.
I didn't even notice.
Yeah, go ahead.
Here's another interesting thing that in some of these Near Eastern countries, so you see this with taxes that were taken up in ancient Egypt when the Israelites were there, and in Babylon and Assyria, but also the Romans. They were not just collecting monetary like coins and money, but they were also collecting other types of things such as grain and livestock and labor. And so some people were starving, like physically starving, and the taxes that were taken from people were literally taking away from their living, from feeding their children and feeding themselves, to be able to have livestock and crops, to being able to have labor, and work. So this was not just like stealing. I don't want to say stealing, but just taking from people's pockets, but taking people's food,
Yeah.
which I don't know, is questionable behavior.
I mean, it's not that different from today, where people we say eat the rich for a reason, right? Of like the top 1% are not being taxed appropriately, and they have more than enough. They are not struggling to feed themselves. Their biggest struggle is like, I have to fix my seventh jet, right? Like that's crazy. And yet we're making people who are barely making ends meet, if they even are making ends meet. I remember I used to volunteer for this organization that helped people who couldn't afford to get their taxes done but needed help. I told this story recently, and I don't know if it was on the podcast or somewhere else, but I told this recently. But there were people who would come in and I'd help them do their taxes, because it was just it wasn't, I'm not an accountant, it was just basic taxes, right? Like I'd read the instructions, I'd help them out. And there were a couple couples. There was one specifically, they came in, they presented very, I hate this word, but like normal. They came in and I helped them with all their taxes, but then we had to put their address. And they both had full-time jobs, plus they both had part-time jobs. And they said, we don't have an address. And I said, what do you mean you need an address? And they said, we live in our car, and we have it was like a past year and a half or 2 years or something like that. They didn't have an address. So I don't know what happened. I had to pass that to my superior, because how do you pay taxes if you don't have an address? But that was, I was in my mid-20s, and I just didn't, that was the first time, that's the closest I've come to seeing like, but you both work. And they couldn't, that was just crazy. They didn't make enough money to make ends meet. So I think that we're already here of like, we're making people pay taxes to make the wealthy wealthier, to drop bombs on our supposed enemies, as if that's what we're called to do anyway. And it's just all really corrupt, and we're all part of the system, and there is no escaping it. Just like there is no escaping paying your taxes to Rome. And what do you do in that situation? So when the gospel writers pair tax collectors and sinners, they're really encoding this like social critique of empire and class.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, which is really my last main point, which I would think I've made over and over again, which is the Jesus story is political. The Jesus story is about class and wealth and poverty. It's gritty, it's fleshy, it's about the here and now. It's about a social and political reality then that can also speak to right now, especially right now. I think that's important. It's not just this like inner morality, and it's not just this spirituality, and it's for sure not just I claim Jesus as my Lord and Savior, so my soul is safe forever. That is not the interesting part of this story. That is not the transformative part of this story.
I would agree.
Right.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah.
And just putting the emphasis for my kind of closing thing here is just putting the emphasis that that Jesus of Nazareth saw these people as human beings who were part and parcel, really, um, and needed someone to see them
Yeah.
for who they were in a time where people didn't want to look at them, and it was Jesus and Jesus's followers who kind of included those people, and that's still kind of I shouldn't say kind of, but still the message of Jesus's teachings today, to include people when we think that maybe a certain group shouldn't be included.
Yeah. I have a question. I want to know your answer, and I'll share my answer then before we leave. Do you have like a favorite biblical character? Don't say Jesus. Give me another one. Like who's compelling, even if it's just not for all time, but just recently.
Yeah.
I'm really putting you on the spot.
No, no. I'm fascinated. I said it in my sermon this past week. I'm fascinated with Thomas.
Mm.
Yeah, I find
that.
I find myself having a similar I find myself
But doubting, but being loyal anyway.
Yeah, I find myself being committed to the community and the teachings of Jesus, while at the same time struggling sometimes with those. So Thomas, to me, is a very
I feel like you could frame it from what I witnessed with you. You could frame it as struggling. I feel like it's more wrestling with it.
Sure. You could.
I mean, Israel means to wrestle with God. Like God's people are called to wrestle with God. I'm going to give you two guesses. Who do you think is my favorite?
Mary Magdalene.
She's my number two. Who do you think is number one?
Is it Esther?
No.
Um,
one more guess. I'm surprised you wouldn't guess him.
Guess him, did you say?
Him. The real rebel.
Oh, John the Baptist.
John the Baptist is my favorite.
Yeah.
He's just such a rebel and does what's not expected of him and is really committed to the cause.
Yeah.
Outside the establishment kind of way that I find very appealing, although I am very much inside the establishments these days. But
but you have John the Baptist energy.
I know. I know. I just find him very compelling.
Yeah. John the Baptist is a good one. Thomas is definitely mine. I have some Old Testament figures that I also like, and I like some, and real quick, I like some of the I don't want to take too much time on this because this is not what we're talking about, but I like some of the lesser known characters because you can kind of like I don't know, like the Phoebes. The Phoebes and the Tabithas and the Junias, and some of those women, specifically in the New Testament, that actually are part of Paul's ministry. They're fascinating to me. The Lydias. Well, there's only one Lydia, but people that followed her.
We named our first daughter Tabitha, but I like Tabitha of Joppa. I like the idea of women helping women and a community of women where all the men are either off to sea or they died at sea, right? In Joppa, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we could do a whole episode just on biblical characters that we like. All right, stay curious.
Stay curious.
To understand